Babylon was not just a city. It was a furnace of power. Stone towers stabbed the sky, walls stretched for miles, and the hanging gardens shimmered like something stolen from paradise. Gold glittered, slaves groaned. Incense burned thick, suffocating the air with smoke. Drums thundered like a heartbeat that never stopped. But beneath that beauty was rot, a darkness no king could polish with stone. Behind temple walls, behind guarded doors, rituals unfolded that would scar history forever. Whispers spoke of them. The so-called mystery schools. Secret orders of priests who promised divine wisdom, but delivered something else entirely. Here, sex was not pleasure. It was weapon. It was ritual. It was sacrifice. Flesh twisted into currency. Innocence was dragged to the altar and slaughtered without a blade. You hear the chains first. A metallic rattle from the shadows. Then the chanting, low, monotonous. Dozens of voices locked together like soldiers marching to war. The smell of sweat. The sting of oil and blood. Women stripped of names. Men stripped of pride. Reduced to bodies. Reduced to tools. Virgins were not protected in Babylon. They were offered. Each one paraded into the chamber like an animal marked for slaughter. Priests in sacred robes stood above them, masks hiding their faces, voices booming with the words of gods, yet dripping with hunger. What happened next was never written in law tablets, never carved into monuments. The kings wanted the glory of gardens, not the stench of sanctuaries soaked in flesh. But it happened. Again and again. For centuries. The mystery schools thrived because no one dared oppose them. To question their rituals was to question the gods. And in Babylon, to question the gods was a death sentence. Initiates stepped into those chambers as people. They never came out the same. Their minds were broken, their bodies marked, their souls enslaved. This wasn't enlightenment. It was humiliation weaponized. It was indoctrination through degradation. The priests promised transcendence, but what they gave was torment. What they gave was madness. And it worked. The terror bound people tighter than chains ever could. Once you had been dragged into the chamber, once you had tasted the ritual, you belonged to them forever. The city outside kept dancing. Soldiers drank. Merchants traded. Kings plotted. Citizens prayed to gods they barely understood. And all the while, deep beneath the stone, the mystery schools whispered their poison into Babylon's veins. The rituals were grotesque, obscene, beyond imagination, which is why historians bury them, which is why textbooks skip the details. They prefer the glory, the gardens, the gold, not the screams in the dark, not the rituals where sex and blood collided until the line between worship and violation vanished. But it was real. Every whisper, every ritual, every scream swallowed by the pounding drums. The priests called themselves servants of the divine, but they were predators, cloaked in sanctity, masters of control, manipulators of flesh and fear. Babylon's splendor was built on more than stone and slaves. It was built on submission, on secrets, on the broken bodies of those dragged into the shadows and never seen the same way again. And this is just the beginning. The veil has only been lifted a fraction. Because once you step further into these rituals, once you see what the initiation of virgins really meant you, Allel realized Babylon's darkness went deeper than anyone dares admit. They called it holy. They called it sacred. But for the women of Babylon, it was nothing less than a sentence. Every daughter, no matter her rank, no matter her beauty, was bound to the same fate. At least once in her life, she would be dragged into the temple of Ishtar. The goddess of sex, war, and chaos demanded flesh, and flesh would be given. Imagine the fear. A virgin stripped of her jewelry, her veil torn from her head, oil rubbed onto her skin until it gleamed beneath the torches. She sits on cold stone among hundreds of others, each one trembling, each one waiting to be claimed. The rules are simple. She cannot leave, not until a stranger chooses her, not until a coin clatters into her lap, sealing her humiliation in the name of the goddess. It doesn't matter who the man is. He may be rich, diseased, old, mangled by war, his body rotting, his breath stinking of wine. She has no choice. Once the coin falls, she is his. The priests call this devotion, but it is not worship. It is degradation turned into law. The girl must spread her legs on the temple floor. She must surrender her body before the gods. And she must do it under the eyes of men who claim to serve the divine. Priests watch from the shadows, their faces hard, unmoving. They are not protectors. They are enforcers. If she resists, they drag her back. If she refuses, they call it blasphemy. And blasphemy is punished, sometimes by beatings, sometimes by death. The sound of coins echoes through the chamber, metal hitting stone. The women flinch each time, praying for someone kind. But mercy is rare here. More often, they are taken by men who delight in cruelty, men who savor fear. You hear the whispers, the cries muffled into silence, the sick laughter of strangers who treat the temple not as a sanctuary, but as a marketplace of flesh. To the outside world, Babylon boasts of its gardens, its towers, its brilliance. But inside these walls, the brilliance rots. Young women reduced to offerings, virgins transformed into sacrifices. When it is over, when the stranger has finished, she is told she is now purified. The coin is kept by the temple. She is pushed back into the streets, her innocence gone, her body branded with shame. Some never recover, some never speak of it again. But for others, this is only the beginning, because the mystery schools demanded more. This initiation was only the first taste of submission. The real rituals lay deeper in the shadows. Here, the priests claimed they could strip away the last shreds of innocence. Here, they said they would teach divine wisdom. But their wisdom was twisted. Their enlightenment was torment. The virgins who returned were no longer girls. They were broken things bound to silence, bound to secrets. They had stepped into the temple once, and now the temple owned them forever. The goddess of love had become a goddess of chains, and the priests were her executioners. This was not faith. It was indoctrination through defilement. A machine of humiliation that turned sacred vows into nightmares. And the terrifying truth? This ritual was not rare. It was mandatory. It was woven into the very laws of Babylonian society. A civilization worshipped for its brilliance was built on the backs of violated women. What began as a single night of surrender often dragged on into years of servitude. Because once the mystery schools marked you, you were never free. They could call you back. They could pull you deeper. And each time, the rituals grew worse. The chants grew louder. The torches burned hotter. The chains grew tighter. And once the virgins crossed into the next stage, there was no turning back. Because the mystery schools had something even darker waiting. Something far beyond shame. Something they called the rite of rebirth. The doors closed. The world outside vanished. What waited inside was not worship, but frenzy. Torches smoked, filling the chamber with a choking haze. The heat pressed against the skin, sweat dripping before the first cry even rose. Then came the drums, relentless, hammering like 1,000 hearts exploding at once. The priests called it the rite of rebirth. But what it really was annihilation. To be reborn, you first had to die, not in body, in self, in identity. Every shred of innocence had to be stripped away, drowned in sweat and screams. The initiates were herded into the chamber, dozens, sometimes hundreds. They were blindfolded, stripped, chained to strangers. No names, no voices, Only flesh pressed against flesh in the crush of bodies. You hear the first moans, then the cries, then the frenzy. Arms clawing, mouths biting. Skin against skin, until there was no telling where one body ended and another began. This was not love. This was not desire. It was chaos orchestrated by the priests. They controlled the rhythm. Their chants rose above the madness, harsh syllables carved into the skulls of those forced to listen. They cracked whips when bodies slowed. They spilled blood when exhaustion threatened to silence the room. A knife dragged across a chest. A scream swallowed by the drumbeat. Pain blended with sex until the two became indistinguishable. The floor turned slick. Semen, blood, sweat. The smell was suffocating, metallic and sour. Flesh slapped against flesh in endless waves, and the priests declared it sacred. The initiates lost track of time. Hours dissolved into delirium. Blindfolds made the darkness eternal. Some collapsed, too weak to move. Their bodies pawed and used even as they drifted in and out of consciousness. Others screamed until their throats broke, only to be drowned out by the drums and the chanting. There was no choice here, no escape. The rite of rebirth was designed to erase the self, to crush resistance, to melt every mind into submission. And when the frenzy finally slowed, when the last cries were swallowed in the smoke, the priests leaned close to the broken bodies sprawled across the stone. They whispered, "Now you are reborn. Now you are ours." The survivors staggered, shaking, their bodies scarred, their dignity obliterated. They were no longer individuals. They belonged to the mystery schools, servants of the priests, property of the goddess. But the horror did not end when the torches burned out, because the real purpose of the ritual was never the sex. It was the control. Once the body had been pushed past its limits, once the will had been crushed under pain and frenzy, the mind could be reshaped like clay. The priests understood this. They understood that if you could break someone in ritual, you could own them forever. And that was the true meaning of rebirth. Not freedom, not enlightenment, slavery. Babylon's citizens believed the goddess demanded this ecstasy, that the chaos of flesh and blood would bring fertility to the land, victory in war, prosperity to the empire. But the truth was simpler. The goddess was an excuse. The priests were the true architects of this nightmare, and they fed on obedience, carved through torment. Those who endured the rite were marked forever. Some walked back into the city with dead eyes. Some never walked out at all. The chambers of rebirth were not only places of sex and screams. They were places of sacrifice. Because as the orgies ended, another sound always followed. The sound of animals dragged into the chamber, the bleating of goats, the cries of infants, the sharp crack of knives against flesh. Sex was only the beginning. The true offerings were blood. The frenzy never ended with flesh. It always ended with blood. The priests called it sacred. The crowd called it divine. But to the initiates trapped inside the chambers, it was terror made ritual. When the orgies reached their peak, when the screams became a single unbroken roar, the priests gave the signal. Animals were dragged in, kicking and thrashing, their hooves scraping stone. Knives flashed, throats were slit. Hot blood sprayed across naked bodies already slick with sweat. You hear the shrieks of goats, the panicked cries of oxen. Then silence as their corpses collapse at your feet. The blood runs across the floor, warm and steaming, soaking into the tangled bodies still gasping in exhaustion. But animals were not always enough. Some accounts whisper of children taken from their mothers, infants offered to Moloch. The ritual fires roared. Tiny limbs flailed as the drums drowned out the screams. The priests lifted their hands to the sky, declaring the gods had been fed. The initiates watched. Some vomited. Some wept. But all were forced to stay, to witness, to accept that once you had entered, you belonged to the ritual. To refuse was death. To resist was madness. And the horror escalated further. It was not only blood spilled beside sex. It was sex fused with sacrifice. Women dragged onto stone altars slick with gore, forced to copulate under the watch of priests. Their bodies cut, their skin carved with knives as offerings, while they still writhed beneath strangers. The smell was unbearable. Sweat, semen, iron, smoke. The taste of blood clung to the air, thick enough to choke. The chants rose higher, the rhythm faster, until the chamber was nothing but a furnace of screams and slaughter. The priests insisted the gods demanded this union, that fertility, harvests, and victory in war depended on blood spilled in ecstasy. But the truth was darker. These rituals were never about gods. They were about control, about bending the human mind until it broke. Each initiate left the chamber stained forever. Once you had seen the blood, once you had felt the terror, once you had lain on the altar, body carved like a sacrifice, you could never turn back. The priests knew this. They designed it this way. Every horror bound you tighter. Every scar branded you deeper. Secrets became chains. Silence became survival. Some begged to escape. They were silenced. Some tried to reveal what they had seen. They vanished. The mystery schools left no traitors alive. And so the cycle continued. Flesh turned to frenzy. Frenzy turned to sacrifice. Sacrifice turned to silence. Babylon's rulers knew of it. Some even took part. They called it holy marriage when kings mounted temple priestesses. They told the people it was a blessing from Ishtar. But behind the words was humiliation. A ritual meant to strip even kings of dignity, binding them to the cult just as tightly as the lowest initiate. The mystery schools had no boundaries. They consumed women. They consumed men. They consumed children. And they consumed power, because each scream, each act of blood-soaked sex, each secret buried in those chambers became leverage, a tool for the priests to dominate not only bodies but empires. And this was only the beginning of their reach. The screams inside the chamber were not just echoes of worship. They were blueprints for control. They were the foundation of a network that spread far beyond temple walls. The rituals weren't just religion. They were politics. They were blackmail. They were domination by flesh and terror. And once you understand how far their influence stretched into the courts of kings, into the laws of nations, you realize the mystery schools didn't just shape their initiates. They shaped empires. Power in Babylon didn't sit on the throne. It lurked in the shadows of the temple. The priests of the mystery schools were not servants of gods. They were puppet masters of men. Their power wasn't built on armies or wealth, but on secrets dark, humiliating secrets carved into flesh and memory during the rituals of sex and blood. Every initiate who entered the chambers left marked. Some bore scars across their skin. Others carried shame, buried deep in their souls. Women forced to submit on temple floors could never shed the brand of the goddess. Men who spilled seed in blood-soaked rites were bound to silence forever. Their dignity destroyed, their loyalty ensured. You could never confess what you had seen. You could never walk away. The priests held your shame like a dagger to your throat. Whisper a word, and your life was over. Refuse to obey, and you vanished, bodies dumped in the night. Names erased from history. And so the priests climbed higher. Behind the chants, behind the smoke of burning offerings, they became the true rulers of Babylon. Kings gave decrees, but priests decided which king would rise. Generals led armies, but priests whispered which war would be fought. Even laws were shaped to serve the temples, protecting the cult, feeding it power. But no man was too high to escape them. Even the throne was not safe. The king himself was dragged into the cycle, stripped of majesty, under the guise of worship. Every year, he was forced into the sacred marriage. The ritual was presented as holy. The king united with the goddess to bless the land with fertility and victory. But the goddess was no deity. She was a chosen prostitute, crowned in flowers, painted in gold. Before the eyes of the priests, a king was ordered to mount her, ordered to perform, ordered to surrender his dignity as drums thundered. It was never about blessing the land. It was about breaking the king, reducing him to the same flesh as every other initiate, reminding him that his throne rested not on his crown, but on the priests who owned his secrets. In that moment, even the mightiest ruler of Babylon was no different from the lowest slave. Both belonged to the temple. Both belonged to the cult. And this was the brilliance of the mystery schools. They didn't need to conquer with swords. They conquered with humiliation. They bound rulers and peasants alike with shame too heavy to escape. This is how they bent empires. A whisper in a king's ear could decide the fate of nations. A threat to reveal hidden sins could end a dynasty. Men killed, wars fought, alliances shattered, all at the priest's command. The temple was the true throne of Babylon, and the priest sat upon it, invisible but absolute. The deeper one went, the less of himself remained. Every ritual peeled away another layer of self, until nothing was left but obedience, until you were no longer a man, but property. And yet, no power lasts forever. Babylon's walls eventually cracked. The empire fell. Its palaces burned. But the priests did not vanish with the city. Their secrets survived. Their methods endured. Because humiliation, once discovered, never dies. Blackmail is eternal. And the chains of sex and shame are stronger than iron. So when Babylon fell, the cult simply shifted. Its practices bled into Greece, into Rome, into the very veins of empires that followed. The same whispers, the same control, the same dark hunger, clothed in the mask of divinity. The mystery schools had built something far more enduring than Babylon's walls. They had built a weapon of control that would echo across centuries. And what began in those chambers of blood and sex would never truly end. Babylon fell in fire, its walls shattered, its throne broken. But the darkness that was born inside its temples didn't burn with it. The gods of Babylon refused to die. They simply changed their names. Ishtar became Aphrodite, then Venus. Moloch found new masks in Europe's pagan rites. The bloodline of terror flowed silently, reshaped but never broken. In Greece, the cults of Dionysus carried the flame. Wild festivals where order collapsed into madness. Men and women stripped naked, bodies writhing in drunken frenzy. Ritual orgies in the streets, while whispers claimed that deeper in the shadows, blood was spilled for the god of wine and chaos. You can almost hear it, the laughter turning into screams as the ritual descended into violence. Rome inherited the madness. The temples of Venus were filled with sacred prostitutes, their bodies offered not out of devotion, but out of fear. Priests turned pleasure into submission, bending worshippers into tools of control. Saturnalia came each year, days of sanctioned debauchery, where law and morality vanished. But behind the carnival mask, the same ancient power was at work. Babylon's blueprint. Sex, blood, humiliation, always the same. Even as Christianity rose, the echoes could not be silenced. The cults went underground. Mystery rites disguised themselves as brotherhoods, secret orders, heretical sects. In dark chambers lit by torches, men whispered vows of loyalty, sealed with rituals that stripped them of dignity. Oaths sworn on pain of death. Secrets buried in shame and terror. Just as Babylon had taught, the Middle Ages gave birth to new faces of the old gods. Some called them witches. Others called them heretics. But the stories were familiar orgies in the night, blood sacrifices in hidden groves, children taken as offerings. The church hunted them, but each pyre only spread the fear further, and in the smoke, the shadow of Babylon lingered. From the Templars accused of obscene rites, to occult sects whispered about in royal courts, the same pattern appeared again and again. Ritual sex, bloodletting, power hidden behind humiliation. The priests of Babylon were long gone, but their weapon of control lived on perfected, refined, adapted for every new age. And disturbingly, the whispers never stopped. Even now, some claim the echoes still haunt the world. Secret societies of the elite. Oaths sealed in silence. Rumors of rituals behind locked doors where pleasure is twisted into chains, where blood stains the floor, where screams are swallowed by laughter and music. You hear it in the rumors of hidden chambers beneath palaces, in the scandals that vanish overnight, in the sudden rise and fall of leaders whose secrets were never meant to see the light. Different names, different faces, the same ancient blueprint. Because Babylon was never just a city, it was an idea. A system of control crafted from sex, shame, and sacrifice. And ideas do not burn. They survive. They mutate. They slip through centuries, reshaping themselves in new languages, new costumes, new gods. Babylon's temples may be rubble, its ziggurats dust, but its darkness still walks among us. And the most terrifying part? The story isn't over. The blueprint still breathes. And what began in fire and blood may yet be alive in places we dare not look. The temples are gone, the idols shattered, the chants silenced by centuries of dust. But the darkness they birthed never died. It clings to history like a parasite, feeding, waiting, returning in new disguises. Every time sex is twisted into a weapon, Babylon breathes again. Every time a ritual strips a body of dignity, its shadow rises. Every time a priest, a ruler, or a leader hides behind religion while practicing cruelty, the curse of Babylon spreads like blood in water. You hear the echoes even now, in the whispers that stain corridors of power. Civilization's birthplace was also a cradle of depravity. The same brilliance that raised the Hanging Gardens also built temples where humiliation was sanctified. Men forced into submission. Women branded as vessels of gods, but treated as tools. Secrets carved into flesh, bound by chains of silence. What looked like worship was nothing more than domination. The Persians set Babylon aflame, but fire cannot burn ideas. The cults scattered like embers on the wind. Into Greece, where Dionysian rites carried drunken ecstasy into blood-soaked frenzy. Into Rome, where Saturnalia turned streets into arenas of chaos, and temples of Venus blurred the line between worship and exploitation. The blueprint survived. Sex, blood, shame, always the same cycle. Always the same chain tightening around humanity's throat. Centuries later, the shadows still slithered. Medieval Europe whispered of heretics who met under the moon, where orgies and sacrifices honored demons disguised as gods. The Inquisition hunted them. Fires consumed their bodies. But each pyre only confirmed the fear that Babylon's curse was eternal. That every ritual, every chant, every obscene oath traced back to the ruins of that ancient city. History books dress it up with softer words. They speak of art, law, and mathematics. They write about kings and gardens. They build monuments to Babylon's brilliance. But behind the stone, there was rot. Behind the towers, there was blood. Behind the myth, there was horror. A civilization that mastered the stars, but also mastered control through flesh. And disturbingly, the pattern has never stopped. Modern whispers tell of secret lodges, underground cults, and brotherhoods that cloak themselves in respectability. Behind locked doors, rituals unfold sometimes, dressed as initiation, sometimes disguised as entertainment. Oaths sealed in humiliation. Silence bought through fear. The very same blueprint carved into the bones of Babylon. You can feel it when scandals erupt and then vanish overnight. When names disappear from the headlines, when witnesses fall silent, when those who rise to power carry secrets no one dares expose. chains rattling in the shadows of palaces and parliaments. You hear them if you listen closely enough. This is Babylon's true legacy. Not just towers and gardens, not just cuneiform tablets or astronomy, but a curse that crawled into the bloodstream of humanity itself. A system of control, a weapon of degradation, a nightmare disguised as faith. The echoes hide in plain sight, and once you've seen them, you can never unsee them. Because Babylon never really fell. Its temples may be dust, its statues may lie broken, but its darkness, its blueprint of control through sex and shame still lives. It slips into every age, every empire, every society that dares to rise. And it waits, patient, silent, until the rituals begin again. And when they do, the curse awakens. The gods may have changed their names, but the hunger is the same. Flesh, blood, silence, power. That is the inheritance Babylon left us. And it lingers still in ways far more terrifying than ruins and stones. The real story of Babylon isn't the gardens. It isn't the kings. It isn't the towers scraping the sky. The real story is the nightmare buried beneath the stones. The story of temples where worship was humiliation, where control was carved into the body, where gods fed on the degradation of men and women alike. That story still haunts us. It always will. Because Babylon isn't just history. Babylon is a curse. And it lives on in shadows we are too afraid to face.